The Greeks made major contributions to just about all aspects of culture. As I mentioned in the first lesson, they laid the foundations of Western civilization. They also served as the models for later imitators of high culture. This period is known as the classical period, for it became the standard by which other periods were judged. The Romans adopted much of Greek art, architecture, poetry, and rhetoric. Roman nobles even spoke Greek as a second language. Medieval scholars looked to the Greeks for answers for many contemporary problems. The Renaissance, which means rebirth, meant precisely the rebirth of Greek culture. Even as late as the 1700s, the Enlightenment was inspired by Greek ideas in politics. The Greeks were so certain of their superiority that they considered themselves a standard of civilization. All other cultures were labeled as barbarians. The Greeks were polytheists, but they didn't have a professional priesthood to establish set religious observances. Instead, people sacrificed in their homes, and public religious rituals were conducted by public office holders. Therefore, there was no concept of the separation of church and state. Each Greek polis had a patron deity. Athens had Athena, Sparta had Zeus, and Delphi had Apollo. But still the pantheon of all the Greek gods was respected in all the cities. The Greeks also worshipped through collective social events. Perhaps the most famous example are the Olympic Games, begun in 776 BC and then every 4 years afterwards. These races, boxing matches, and field events were held at the Greek city of Olympia. The Greeks also honored the god through drama, dances, and public singing and poetry recitations. Greek religion did not have a theology. For the answers to life's questions, ancient Greeks looked to their poets and later to their philosophers. As previously implied, the principal Greek gods were the 12 Olympians: Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Demeter, Athena, Hestia, and Hermes. But the Greeks also worshipped a variety of other cults associated with minor gods, such as Dionysius, the god of wine. The Greeks also had mystery cults, where members participated in secret initiation rites to join a group of followers whose secret rituals granted them immortality. The Eleusinian mysteries associated with the Olympian Demeter were one of the early and important mystery cults. As previously noted, the Greeks made major contributions in literature. The first Greek poetry originated during the Dark Age, and was therefore oral, not written. Bards would preserve poetry by memorizing thousands of lines of verse. Eventually, the Greeks reacquired writing through contact with the Phoenicians, and the poetry was fixed by being written down. The Greeks further simplified the Phoenician letters and added vowels to the Phoenician consonants. The greatest epic poems of the ancient Greeks are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have been associated with the blind poet Homer, who lived between 850 and 750 BC. Some believe that Homer may not be an actual person, but rather a collection of many poets, whose works were collapsed together by later writers. The Iliad was a story of the Trojan War. Troy was also known as Ilion. The Odyssey is the story of Odysseus' trip home to Ithaca from the Trojan War, which took him 10 years. The most important virtue of Homer's Greeks was arete, which actually means manliness, but is usually translated as virtue. This was the ideal behavior of warriors, who glorified bravery, strength, honor, reputation, and loyalty to family and friends. Hesiod, who lived around 700 BC, is the second most significant Greek poet. He wrote 2 major poems, Works and Days, which describes what it was like to be a Greek farmer, and Theogony, which includes the birth and legends of the Greek gods. The Greeks also wrote short poems called lyrics on select themes. Archilochus is the founder of this form in the 7th century. Pindar and Sappho of Lesbos are the most famous lyric poets. Pindar wrote victory songs for athletes, while Sappho wrote love poems to fellow women. The Greeks were also the pioneers of drama. Drama is the performance of a dramatic story by a number of speakers, not just one. The first dramas were the reading of a poem by a chorus, a group of singers, alternating back and forth with a single reader. Eventually, this evolved into dialogues involving more actors. As previously mentioned, drama developed as a way to honor the gods. It ultimately split into 2 categories, tragedy and comedy. The tyrant Pisistratus, who initiated the religious celebrations of Dionysius in which drama developed, also instituted the competition between various dramatists in 534 BC. Just as in the Olympic Games, the Greeks competed for excellence. The three greatest Greek tragedians were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus' plays were moral and religious. He generally concentrated on hubris, the vice of excessive pride. Oftentimes, Aeschylus' characters are headstrong, and therefore bring nemesis, or divine punishment, down upon themselves. His most famous plays are the Oresteia trilogy and Prometheus Bound. Sophocles also concentrated on religion and morality, but he tended to highlight the plight of humans who are born to suffer in an ignorant world. His three plays about the Theban king Oedipus are his best known. Euripides' plays were different than the others because they centered on the psychology of the characters rather than moral and religious concerns. His most famous play is Medea, a witch who killed her own children when she finds out about her husband's adultery. Most unusually, she gets away with the crime without punishment. Euripides won less often than the others, partly because he treated his themes so unconventionally. Comedy was also developed by the Greeks in the context of the festival of Dionysius. They could be lighthearted and slapstick, or else satirical critiques of Greek society. The most famous Greek comedian was Aristophanes, who was a harsh satirist. He wrote throughout the Peloponnesian War, and many of his plays ridiculed the pointlessness of the war. He regularly poked fun at Pericles, Euripides, and Socrates. The Greeks also developed prose writing to explain history and philosophy. The two most famous Greek historians were Herodotus and Thucydides. Herodotus is commonly called the father of history for writing a history of the Persian Wars. A native of Ionia, he divided civilization between the East and the West and saw the Greeks as the exemplars of Western civilization. In his book, titled The Histories, he often went on long tangents that aren't relevant to the Persian Wars, but certainly illuminated much about the ancient world. Thucydides was an Athenian general who failed to win an early battle in the Peloponnesian War and was exiled as a result. He would spend the rest of the war traveling throughout Greece, and his account of the war is both impartial and based on eyewitness reports. Perhaps most famously, he reported the speeches of the principal participants, recalled by memory, or else by notes, or else by reports of others who heard the speeches. The most famous of these speeches is the oration given by Pericles in 430 to honor fallen Athenian soldiers. Philosophy was also a brainchild of the ancient Greeks. The oldest philosophers were usually interested in the basic mechanics of the universe. They are collectively known as the pre-Socratics, because they came before Socrates, who reoriented philosophy towards ethics. The pre-Socratics pursued early scientific investigations about the physical world and natural phenomena. They eschewed religious answers, but didn't truly establish a scientific method. The first of these men was Thales of Miletus in Ionia. He wanted to know what was the most basic substance that made up everything in the physical universe. Heraclitus believed that the answer was fire. He also investigated change and permanence, and he is best remembered for saying that you cannot step into the same river twice. The philosopher Empedocles would eventually develop the theory that there are four basic elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and this would remain the basic understanding until the modern period. Not everyone agreed. Democritus believed that everything was made up of atoms. The word he used was atoma, which means indivisible. Pythagoras believed that all of reality could be explained in mathematical terms. He is also credited with an influential theory of triangles. The basic theory of elements and atoms, and the mathematical descriptions of physical objects were all developed by these pre-Socratic philosophers. Another influential Greek thinker of this period was Hippocrates of Kos. He is known as the father of medicine for his studies on disease in which he stressed observation over theory. He also described diseases with details about symptoms for later doctors. He emphasized the importance of hygiene, diet, and the environment for good health. Hippocrates generally avoided religious explanations for diseases in favor of natural causes. His name is also associated with the medical code of ethics, which is known as the Hippocratic Oath. Our word philosopher comes from the Greek words philos and sophos, which mean lover and wisdom. Therefore, a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom. According to legend, Pythagoras was the first to use the term. In particular, Pythagoras apparently responded that he wasn't a wise man, but he loved wisdom. Therefore, philosophers work towards gaining wisdom without assuming that they already have it. In the 400s BC, a group of itinerant teachers arose in Greece who called themselves sophists or wise men. For a fee, they promised to teach students how to be skilled public workers, which would make them successful politicians. Socrates was often mistaken for a sophist. Aristophanes even called him one in one of his comedies. Nevertheless, he differed from the sophists in a number of ways. First, he didn't charge any fees. Also, he didn't think of himself as a teacher, but simply someone who helped others gain truth. He even referred to himself as a gadfly, because he discovered that the people he questioned and investigated didn't appreciate his methods or his results. Socrates developed what would be known as the Socratic method, a rigorous questioning of those who claimed to have knowledge that generally concluded that they didn't know what they thought they knew. Socrates also changed the focus of philosophy towards ethics. He felt that the polis needed moral citizens, and he saw this as a legitimate goal for his life. Socrates worried that Athenians cared more for military and economic success than they did for their souls. Socrates wrote nothing, so we have to rely on others' accounts of his teachings, and the primary sources for his teaching are Plato's dialogues. Socrates was ultimately accused of corrupting the Athenian youth with his questioning methods during the difficult days following their defeat in the Peloponnesian Wars. He was found guilty and executed by drinking hemlock. Part of the reason that Plato wrote his dialogues was to refute the charges against Socrates. In addition to writing the dialogues, Plato also founded the Academy, a school in Athens. The centerpiece of Plato's philosophy was his theory of forms or ideas. To Plato, there is a spiritual world that exists beyond the material world of our senses that gives our world its existence. The forms are abstract principles that exist in a spiritual world. They are perfect and unchanging, whereas physical objects in our world change, and so are imperfect copies of the forms. Plato sometimes used geometrical examples to describe his theory. But the most important of his forms was the good. He compared it to an intellectual sun, since the mind that could perceive the good could use it to illuminate the mind to make moral judgments. Plato believed that Socrates was executed because the Athenians didn't know the form of the good. They were mistaken into thinking that killing Socrates was good. The most famous of Plato's dialogues is the Republic, which describes an ideal city which was not democratic. Plato believed, after all, that democracy had killed Socrates. In the Republic, an ideal society was made up of three types of people in a hierarchy. The workers were at the bottom, then came the guardians, who served as soldiers and police, and then the enlightened philosophers at the top, who truly ruled. Aristotle was Plato's most talented student, and he would ultimately match his teacher. After Plato's death, Aristotle opened his own school, the Lyceum. He taught every subject, from biology to astronomy to literary criticism to metaphysics to politics to ethics. He even developed the rules of logic to be used by all subjects. He did take a rather different metaphysical approach than Plato. He rejected the forms and argued that all objects contain the form within themselves. He believed that there was only one universe, which was ordered by an entity he called the prime mover. In ethics, Aristotle developed the golden mean, an idea that the good life can be maintained through moderation rather than extreme behaviors of any sort. In politics, he argued that the good life needed the polis to provide good laws to educated citizens. Aristotle defined three types of government, each of which could act justly or unjustly. The rule of one man could be monarchy or tyranny. The rule by a few men could be aristocracy if just, or oligarchy if unjust. The rule of the many he called polity, which is the ideal rule of the polis, or else rule by the mob. He used the term democracy to describe this system, because the majority oppressed the minority, such as Socrates. Therefore, Aristotle agreed with Plato that democracy was bad. The oldest Greek art form, from the Archaic Age, are paintings on pottery. These are rudimentary objects with beautiful art created on them, for they were used in the everyday transportation of food. During the Mycenaean period, these pots were decorated with the geometric patterns of black figures on red backgrounds. Over time, images replaced designs, typically from mythological events or daily life. The Greeks also mastered the art of sculpture in both marble and bronze. The first Greek statues clearly reflected Egyptian models, for they were stiff and formal. By the 480s and the birth of the classical period, they had evolved into a newer level of realism. Although Greek sculptures were capable of realistic representations, classical Greek sculptures often served religious functions and therefore tried to represent ideals, forms. Patron deity statues were set up in temples to serve both aesthetic and religious purposes. The Greeks idealized the principles of harmony and proportion, and this is evident in their simple, elegant temples. The typical temple was rectangular, with a triangular angled roof that ended in what was known as a pediment. These pediments hung over columned porches as the entrance to the temple proper. Below these pediments, temples typically had horizontal bands. You can see an image of the pediment and these horizontal bands known as friezes on the lower left here. These pediments were usually covered with relief sculptures of mythological scenes. In addition to the porch, most temples were surrounded by columns. The Greeks had three basic designs or orders of column, which you can see here: the plain Doric, the Ionic, which had a pair of scroll-like spirals at the top, and the Corinthian, which is the most ornate. The preeminent example of a Greek temple is the Parthenon, located on the Acropolis of Athens and pictured at the top of this page. As previously mentioned, it was constructed during Pericles' building campaign and it still stands today. The sculptures that originally were on the pediments were removed in the 1800s by British archaeologists and are now in the British Museum, and one of them is pictured in the lower right-hand side of the page. These are now known as the Elgin marbles, since it was Lord Elgin who led the expedition that took away the marbles. At one time, an immense statue of Athena stood inside, made of gold and ivory, but this wonder of the ancient world has since been destroyed. This Athena was designed by the sculptor Phidias, who was hired by Pericles. Phidias was a master of realism and had also created an enormous statue of Zeus. Another temple on the Acropolis is the Erechtheum, pictured on the lower left here. The Erechtheum is famous for its porch, because the columns are actually sculptures of women holding up the roof with their heads. These maidens are known as the Caryatids.